Hello everyone! Today I'm going to talk about how I remade SNES Mario Circuit 2 in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe twice. This is the second in a series of videos I'm doing where I discuss how I made each of my Mario Kart 8 Deluxe custom tracks. Though chronologically, this was actually the third track I made because I'm skipping over my remake of GBA Rainbow Road for now. I don't want to spend another video endlessly complaining about one of my bad old tracks, so if I ever get around to talking about GBA Rainbow Road, that will be after I've updated the track to bring it up to my current standards. And speaking of which, that is exactly what I did with SNES Mario Circuit 2. I first released it in October of 2022, but then 2 years later, after the track was included in CCGP Deluxe, I decided to completely remake it from the ground up. So I'll be talking about these two versions of the track one at a time. The main thing that inspired me to try to remake SNES Mario Circuit 2 is the inclusion of SNES Mario Circuit 3 in Wave 2 of the Booster Course Pass. That track's lackluster Mario Kart Tour visuals inspired a lot of online debate around that time about how little effort Nintendo was truly putting into this DLC. So I guess I wanted to prove that even a novice 3D modeler like myself could do better, though in hindsight I'm not sure if I succeeded in that regard. Anyways, obviously my track is also fundamentally a port of the Mario Kart Tour version of the track, meaning I started work on it by taking the Tour model and applying appropriate Mario Kart 8 Deluxe textures to it. Remember, this was back when I barely knew how to 3D model things from scratch, so I decided to cut some corners when it came to the visuals of the track's surroundings. The original SNES Mario Circuit tracks feature these iconic green hills and trees in the background, and the same also goes for SNES Battle Course 4. However, when I was working on this track, I wrongfully assumed that the Super Mario Kart Battle Course with the green hills and trees was Battle Course 1, so I thought Nintendo was the one cutting corners by reusing the Donut Plains environment for their Mario Kart 8 Deluxe remake of SNES Battle Course 1, even though that was actually fitting, and I figured I could therefore do the same thing for my track. So I removed the main track section of SNES Battle Course 1, plopped my Mario Kart Tour model in its place, and thought I'd found a sort of reasonable loophole, even though I was actually just plain wrong. At least some of the other Mario Kart 8 assets I added onto the track did make a bit more sense. For example, I added a bunch of these wooden scaffold platforms from GBA Mario Circuit on the side of the road, and I even went as far as copying over this entire building from that track as well. I also ported over some tents, and pipes, and a truck, and some speakers, and of course I also couldn't forget about these massive brick and question mark blocks that are all over Mario Kart 8 tracks for some reason. I remember being very proud of modeling most of this ramp myself. It's basically the track's only model that isn't a one-to-one copy of something from one of the original game's tracks. Actually, in terms of working on the track's model, the thing that may have taken the longest was actually applying all of the appropriate colors to all of these blocks around the track. So as you're probably aware, Mario Kart Tour doesn't rely on textures for most of its models. Instead, it just applies vertex colors to them to save on storage space, I guess. And because I wanted to apply proper Mario Kart 8 textures to every aspect of my track, I had to manually select each chunk of these blocks over and over again and apply the right textures to each set. It's funny because in hindsight it would have probably taken less time to just replace all of these blocks with their Mario Kart 8 equivalent, which also would have looked way better. But at the time I guess I preferred the idea of spending ages manually tweaking UV maps over having to work with 3D models any more than I strictly needed to. So when it came to adding unique touches to the track, I mostly relied on custom textures, like this Mario symbol that I put around where the players would land after gliding, just like this Peach symbol in Royal Raceway. I also made the roofs of these GBA Mario Circuit buildings blue, though in hindsight I don't really like the way that looks. Speaking of those buildings though, there was really only one major gameplay related decision that I had to make for this track. So when Nintendo brought SNES Mario Circuit 2 back in Mario Kart 7, not only did they turn this boost ramp into a glider ramp, but they also added this strange pulsating bouncy yellow block that allows players to cut off this last corner with their glider. Now, something I really appreciate about Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is how it takes some of the series' more random and outlandish mechanics and makes them feel more integrated into the world. So I considered trying to recontextualize this bouncy yellow block thing by making it a bouncy version of one of these bumper blocks, or maybe a truck that's parked along the side of the road, but because I was having problems getting Mario Kart 8's bouncy collision to function properly, I decided to just rework the shortcut completely, and place an additional building on the side here that players can trick off of. I'm sure many people have mixed feelings on this change, and so do I, to be honest, but for what it's worth, I don't think retro tracks are obligated to include elements that were only a part of previous remakes of the same track. And speaking of this glider section, when it came to the track's collision, I placed invisible walls all around the track, except for around this section, because obviously I wanted to give the players the freedom of gliding and driving across the colorful blocks. And that's actually the same way collision is handled in GBA Mario Circuit, though I did make a bit of a mistake when it came to my track's collision. I thought I could get away with not giving collision to anything that the player couldn't possibly touch while driving around the track. And at first that may sound reasonable to you, but remember that players can throw items. So for example, I didn't give the starting line banner collision because there's no way players could drive into that, but that means you can chuck an item like a banana straight through it. The same also went for any background details like those buildings I talked about. I didn't bother giving those collisions, so items can clip into them. But either way, once I mistakenly thought I'd properly modeled the track's collision, I imported the track into the game, and then it was time to make it actually function. When it came to object placements, I didn't have to do much decision making because I copied over the locations of things like item boxes, coins, oil slicks, and pipes from the Mario Kart 7 version of the track. Normally, the main way the game keeps track of whether the player is in bounds or not is using these lap path boxes, but because it was basically impossible to go out of bounds throughout most of the track, implementing those didn't take a lot of work either. The only section that was a bit troublesome was the glider ramp part, where you jump over a different part of the track, because I had to make sure this area was out of bounds, but not when you're driving through it, obviously. This was also the first track in which I added these birds that fly away once you approach them. And I believe at the time, Track Studio, the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe track editor program, couldn't properly connect those to the paths they require. So I had to manually edit the track's YAML as a text file, which was the first time I'd done that. And after adding some NPCs and paths for the items and CPU drivers, the original incarnation of the track was finished. So you might be wondering, when it was time to update the track, why did I remake it from scratch instead of just fixing the problems I had with the old version? I could have just replaced the visuals of the backdrop and then tweaked whatever else I wanted to change, and that would have been okay, right? Well, the problem is that the foundation of how I made this old version of the track was inherently flawed. A subtle change that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe made to even its most simple tracks is that no track in the original game is completely flat. These small elevation changes help to make the turns both easier to see and to drive around. Even a track like SNES Rainbow Road, which should logically be completely flat, actually subtly changes elevation in places to make upcoming turns easier to see. But you know which game doesn't do this kind of stuff, at least when it comes to SNES tracks? Mario Kart Tour. So that's why, even ignoring the visuals, tracks like SNES Mario Circuit 3 in the Booster Course Pass are fundamentally different to how these tracks would have been modeled had they been a part of the original track selection. Now, I could have technically tried reshaping this old track model to give it the banked turns and subtle elevation changes that I wanted to implement. However, I also wanted to replace these Mario Kart Tour blocks with their Mario Kart 8 equivalent. And since, on top of that, I wasn't keeping the surrounding visuals, at that point I figured I might as well remake the entire thing. Actually, that's not entirely true. I did keep a modified version of the road mesh from the original Mario Kart Tour model, since there was no need to remake that. Either way, it was time to start modeling. I added all of those colored blocks back in, this time using their Mario Kart 8 model. Then I filled in the sand in between, and made sure to match the way the original game models the transition between road and sand, including these red and white curbstones. Then I distorted the track model to give the road the banked turns and elevation changes I was looking for. Then, in order to recreate the surroundings of the original SNES track, I actually used the Mario Kart Tour backdrop model as a basis, but I made the shape of the hills way more varied, and added more details in the form of cliffs, pipes, blocks, blocks and trees. In fact, these trees actually use custom models that are supposed to resemble these original trees in the Mario Kart 8 style, and I think they look good. In keeping with both SNES Battle Course 1 and Donut Lanes 3, I also added a Toad House to my track, and at this point I started focusing on the details of the track environment itself. So I added billboards and these cushion and tire setups, I modeled stands that match the look of the colored blocks, and I even made a somewhat custom finish line that resembles the one from Donut Lanes 3. I also brought back some of the elements I included in the original incarnation of the track, such as the wooden scaffold platforms and speakers dotted around the track. And out of boredom, I suppose, I added 2 subtle references to the track's origins as a Super Mario Kart track. I put this tic-tac-toe thing on the grass in front of the glider ramp, which is a reference to Super Mario Kart's title screen, and I also put a few missing persons posters around the track that reference Donkey Kong Jr.'s lack of appearances since the SNES original. And by the way, I also referenced one of my own custom tracks. You might think all of these billboards use advertisements from the original game, but both this Moo Moo Milk and Mount Wario ads are actually custom. In Moo Moo Meadows, the milk brand is called Moo Moo Meadows Milk, but since I also wanted to feature it in Moo Moo Mountain, my custom track, I renamed it and kept that consistent for this SNES Mario Circuit 2 remake. One of the balloons in that track also has this custom Mount Wario Mountain Resort advertisement, so once again, I also kept that consistent here. Okay, so far this sounds like a purely visual update, but I did also make some subtle design tweaks. For example, I fixed all of those collision issues I pointed out in the original version of the track, so all of these background details now have proper collision in case an item collides with them. Although I kept those same invisible walls all along the track, I had to remove them for this part here, because I never liked how if you drive off of the ramp in the original version of the track, you'll land on the road driving diagonally facing in the wrong direction for the next turn, which made the shortcut quite suboptimal. So for the new version, I rotated the ramp, which also has the side effect of allowing you to drive on this part of the wall briefly to cut off even more of this turn, which I think is really cool. I also decided to keep the glider shortcut mostly the same, though because I removed the GBA Mario Circuit buildings, the player can now trick off of a big question mark block instead. And apart from that, yeah, the changes pretty much just came down to visuals. All of the item boxes and coins are all still in the same place. It took me a while to decide what to do for this track's skybox. The original SNES Mario Circuit tracks feature this iconic yellow sky, meaning I guess the tracks all take place during sunset. However, when I tried making my track sunset, it just didn't feel right. The overwhelmingly orange lighting just doesn't jive with what is supposed to be a generic circuit track, in my opinion. But I also didn't want the sky to be completely blue, like in the first version of the track, so I ended up settling on a compromise. Most of the sunset skyboxes in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe are kind of weird because they make the entire sky a single color, as opposed to a proper realistic sunset gradient where only one side of the sky is affected. So in order to both reference the original track's yellow skybox and keep the more appropriate blue lighting, I made a custom skybox that features a sunset gradient where the sky and clouds only appear yellow on one side. And honestly, I think that's one of the best decisions I made for this update. It's like a perfect metaphor for how this version of the track is a compromise between sticking to the visuals of the SNES original and updating things to match Mario Kart 8's design language. And that brings me on to the final point I want to make, which is that I could have easily gone much further with the track's visuals. I don't want to throw any other custom track creators under the bus, but I've seen a lot of people look at Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's very busy visual style and interpret that by spamming their custom tracks with details until they burst. But if we actually look at the SNES tracks in the original game, the visual density is deceivingly low. So while I could have added more things to look at around my track's environment, or I could have added more NPCs or some custom track objects or whatever, if the goal was to match Mario Kart 8's visual style as closely as possible, I think the amount of detail in this track is just about right when compared to other SNES retros. So that's it. That's how I remade SNES Mario Circuit 2 in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe twice. The plan for this video series moving forward is that I'll release a new video alongside an update for whichever track I discuss, so that way I can stick to this video's format where I discuss problems and then actually fix them. And I guess that means I sort of have to work on that GBA Rainbow Road update next, and I don't have a clue what I'm going to do for that, honestly. If you have any ideas, maybe let me know by leaving a comment. And while you're down there, I'd also appreciate it if you left a like and considered subscribing or checking out my Discord server or becoming a channel member or something along those lines. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!